Hello and welcome to Left of the Projector. I'm your host, Evan, back again with another film discussion from the left. You can follow the show at leftoftheprojector.com. As you can tell by the title, we are discussing the 2024 Robert Eggers film Nosferatu. And if you tuned in just a few days ago, my guest and I, Alex Herbert, discussed the film from a high level, just giving our initial impressions. So if you want to go just get a few details, you don't want to be spoiled on the film yet, you can go back and listen to that short conversation. But in this episode, we will be diving deep into the spoilers. So fair warning as always for every episode. But Alex, thank you again for coming on.
Of course, always happy to talk about vampires.
If you want to introduce yourself, anything you're working on, I know you have the Lenin volume series, which is linked or will be linked. But before we get into vampires.
Yeah, sure. My name is Alex Herbert. I'm a scholar of the Soviet Union. I've written a few books on Soviet history. One of them explicitly is a short history of horror films in the late USSR. And yeah, I'm a big fan of horror, and Nosferatu is one of those first kind of major horror films in the 1920s, which we'll talk about. So, I was excited to see this as a historical remake, and I'm excited to see it as just a fan of gothic horror and vampires, and so excited to talk about it.
Yes, absolutely. For which you mentioned in the other episode, the short review, but we did also do an episode last summer on the Dracula myth, including the 1922 original Nosferatu, as well as some of the 30s and 50s, and then the Bram Stoker Dracula from 1990,
96, I think, or 94.
Yeah, somewhere around there. Anyway, but so we don't have to go into those, but basically, I mean, I think to talk about this from the beginning, I mean, maybe it is worth very briefly rehashing our thoughts on the film, because I know it's now been 3, 4, or 5 days since we've saw it, and I think we mentioned in the original episode, I walked out of the theater thinking like I really enjoyed that was a great film, and then as I thought about it more, I feel like I gained more appreciation and enjoyment, moving my rating from purely just from my Letterboxd review from 4 to 4.5 stars. So I think, I don't know if has your thoughts changed as you've had more time to think about it?
Yeah, I that's something we talked about in the brief episode, was we had the same experience of kind of walking out of there with a, I think when you walk out of something and you're trying to have a first impression, you're looking for a critical analysis. You're looking to criticize it real quick and find what are the flaws of it, rather than just, stepping outside and saying, these are the good things. And so it's only later that those really good things enter into your mind and they start to expand. And you're like, you know what? Those good aspects of the film far outweigh any of the negatives of the film that might be there. So I think we had a similar experience. Uh-oh, I can't hear you now.
Oh, I was going to say part of that I think also has to do with just the overwhelming hype. I don't know if this is maybe across the board for everyone waiting for this film to come out. I think maybe it's just I had seen, information about it almost a year ago and just waiting. And sometimes when you have that overwhelmingly high expectations, you go in and like you can't ever meet those expectations. But I even went in thinking like, I'm not going to hype this too much. If I like it, I like it, whatever. And I think I was pleasantly surprised, kind of like a mild way to put it. But I've been seeing a lot of reviews. I don't usually go on Letterboxd and like read random strangers' reviews of films that I like, just because I don't know who has the time, and it's not worth, if you like a movie, you like a movie. You don't need people to shit on the things you like maybe. But I've seen an overwhelmingly love for this movie from women, and I mean this is purely from like threads and Twitter. This isn't necessarily the real world. This is the internet world, I suppose. But it does seem like there is a bit of a divide where a lot of men I'm seeing maybe don't hate the movie, but they don't like it maybe as much. I don't know what you make of this, and if it has something to do with the plot in the film, with Ellen character, but yeah, I don't know. We don't have to dwell on this too much, but I thought it would be worth mentioning the internet debates.
I have not looked at many of the reviews for the reasons that you said. Like, I don't want to be tainted by them, I suppose. But I could definitely see why or how there's an aspect of this film that is more resonant with women than it is with men. I mean, to be honest with you, most of the men of the film aren't really that impressive characters. They in terms of the acting is all great, but their character arc, their character development isn't as developed as Ellen's is, for example. With the exception, I guess, of Count Orlok himself, of the vampire, which even that character not developed, but at least every scene that he's in, it creates a different atmosphere. Like, one thing that the film did successfully, and I don't care what the reviewers say, it's true, is it created an atmosphere of dread, so that every time Orlok was in the scene, I was just waiting for something creepy to happen. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It was scary in that way. But again, the men of the movie, the male characters, I don't think are as developed, and there's probably a reason for that.
Yeah, I would say the only other mild exception, well, I don't necessarily think he's developed. I think he has a more positive minded person, is the Willem Dafoe's Professor von Franz, where he, is this sort of controversial scientist, believes in the occult or researches the occult and all these things and understands like what vampires are or Nosferatu are. He doesn't necessarily have an arc in this, but he at least has the foresight of believing, Ellen's story and kind of what's happening with her later on. So maybe there's something to that as why I perceive, maybe women identifying with Ellen as being someone who's a female who's not being believed for things that have happened in their past, whatever it might be, and then actually seeing someone, acknowledge what's going on with them and understand their feelings. And even if it's from a scientific standpoint, at least there's some of that. So I don't know, maybe that's part of it too.
Yeah, I mean, we live in this time where, and this has always been true of horror, but particularly true right now, is that, of course, horror is a commentary on social realities that are happening in our own time. And I think the movie in particular does a good job of bringing out this common horror trope, which is people not believing you, right? There's something going on and you're not being, I mean, my 9-year-old daughter has caught on to this. She said, why is every horror movie, nobody believes the person that's about to die or something like that. But what it does is it puts the onus of the unbelief, I guess, on the woman, on Ellen herself. Whereas, a lot of horror movies that are coming out now, and I mean this not in a negative way, but they're like kind of woke in the sense that, the central characters are, of course, not white males. And it tends to be more spread out. So it's a group of friends, or, it's a black family or whatever. So the fact that this one puts all of that onus of responsibility for convincing somebody around a woman in particular and her experience, I think would also be a reason why a lot of men just don't understand it, right? A lot of dudes just, no matter what race you are, just don't understand the fact that, this woman is going through something that is horrifying and they're just chalking it up to hysteria, just like they did in the 19th century.
Yeah, no, that's I think that's a good way to put it. And we don't necessarily have to dwell on this, but we can kind of skip over to, before we talk maybe about some of the themes that we've already kind of hit on and the things that we really want to dive into. I mean, when we look at it as sort of again, as a remake, it's a remake of the original. Eggers has said, I think we talked about it last time, for decades, he's wanted to remake the original Nosferatu. And of course it has, nods to the book. It has some of the character names from the original Nosferatu using Orlok instead of Dracula. It also kind of leans on other things. But how do you, or what did you think of the purely as a remake, maybe ignoring some of the themes and the plot, but just simply as like a film using the the visuals. I think like the shadow play is very heavily influenced from the original film, more so than any of the other remakes, like the one from '79 from Werner Herzog. So, what did you think of from that perspective?
I saw this interview a while back with Francis Ford Coppola after his Bram Stoker's Dracula came out, where he said, and this was in the '90s, mind you, he said, there are so many Dracula tellings, so many versions of this story that have been made and remade and sequels and prequels and yada yada, that in order to create a Dracula film, which, let's be real, that's what Nosferatu is, even though the characters are different, it's the same plot, it's the same narrative. In order to do that, you have to kind of simultaneously absorb all of these different versions of it, which all of them have their different fans, right? Some people went into this movie wanting to see reflections of the Herzog version. Some people went in wanting to see the reflections of the 1920s. Some people wanted to see Bela Lugosi or whatever. And so you have to kind of absorb all of these different takes and then offer something new. Because if you don't offer something new, then all of these people are going to say, oh, all you did was just copy what has already been done. And in that sense, a lot of the reviews, a lot of the criticisms I've seen, like, Orlok has a mustache, he doesn't look as creepy as he did in the 20s. It's like, well, if you dive into the reasoning for why they made Orlok look the way he did, it's again trying to get back to some kind of historical authentic rendition of this character, providing something new while also retaining again that sense of horror and dread every time you're in his presence. And so I think that in terms of how it matched up to the previous versions of Nosferatu, I think it did a great job, as good as can be done, to make a movie in 2024 that's both present and past. I'll say that.
Yeah, and to add on to that, one of the criticisms I've seen, not just about the Orlok having the mustache, and actually from my recollection, didn't he have a mustache in the book?
I think so. I think Dracula had a mustache. Yeah,
Yeah. So I saw some things about that, but one of the things I actually saw was that this film, the criticism from a lot of people was that it actually didn't break any new ground. It wasn't a new version, and I think we'll get to it through our discussion. Is that I disagree with that greatly. While you could maybe argue that the Orlok in the Herzog version is, quote unquote, better or different in a way that you like, but I don't think it is accurate to say that something new hasn't been accomplished in this film, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Anyway,
but
again, it's just my opinion.
I will say that I think the bigger influence of this film was in the 1920s version, and you could tell from different references to other big films of the time, like the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, where they kept talking about, I'm going to butcher this word, somnambulism, right, which is like sleepwalking. Rather than referring to it as sleepwalking in the film, they keep referring to it as somnambulism. And the character, I think his name is Caesar in Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, he is a somnambulist, right? That's what he does. He sleepwalks, and that's his sort of sideshow shtick. And so there's definitely more influence from the 1920s, again, borrowing a lot of the black and white shadow play. There are scenes in this movie where it's not filmed in black and white, but it's just the set makes it look almost black and white. Like, for example, the scene where he's in the woods about to enter into the castle. It's dark and it looks black and white, but it's not filmed in black and white.
Yeah, and one of the things I saw too, another scene that I thought was phenomenally filmed, aside from many of them, is the scenes in the graveyard, and I think especially the one later in the final third of the kind of the ending of the film, is that apparently when they were filming it, they wanted to use a set or do something else, and Eggers was adamant about having it be like waiting for a dark night that was like misty, so they didn't have to fake anything, so it was actually authentic. And he seems to go out of his way to ensure like this authenticity of both historical information and everything like that, except where you pointed out that it says in the opening title card, it says that it's Germany in 1838, which you pointed out that there technically wasn't a Germany in 1838. So
I mean, it's a minor point. It just seems like a kind of shorthand rather than saying like Bavaria 1838, which most Americans at least would have been like, where the fuck is Bavaria? You know?
right. And so I think one of the, I mean, again, this being a leftist film podcast, and if you listen to our previous episode, we talked about Ron and Marx and other, commentary from critiques of capitalism and all of those things. And I think it's an interesting place to start on the sort of the class dynamics. And I think it's much more, I don't know if about obvious is the right word, but more fleshed out than in the Herzog version, and definitely more than the original 1922 version, of sort of the class dynamics of the different groups of people, where we have Hutter and his wife Emma, who live in, basically in an apartment in a very, I wouldn't say poor part of town, but definitely not a nice area within town, whereas his family friends live in a gigantic estate, that being Friedrich and Anna Harding. He owns a shipping business, which we can also talk about and what kind of that meant. But do you think Eggers was pushing on this intentionally to give us more depth, or just simply by going for this historical accuracy, he just kind of stumbled into having some good critique of class?
Eggers says in interviews that this was a project that he had wanted to do since high school. So it's before he was an established director, and which leads me to assume that within his life, whether in high school or post high school, he had to have done some research outside of just the film of Nosferatu to try to understand, well, what were the socio-economic dynamics of the original 1922 version? And within the literature on that film, of course, there's a lot of talk about the anti-Semitism. There's a lot of talk about post-war Weimar Germany and Expressionism, right? And how a lot of it had just been commenting on the absurdity of really existence, right? That's the point of Expressionism. When you watch The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, for example, all of the background settings are just bizarre. And it's because Germany had just had this horrific World War experience in which, over half of its male population is either dead or coming back maimed in some way from the experience of war. And so life itself seems a little bit absurd. And I think understanding, as I'm going to assume Eggers did, that there is some socioeconomic commentary that's going on in the original. He had to have sort of formed his own version of it with the same mindset that this movie in some way has to be doing what the original did, which is not just a gothic horror for the sake of gothic horror because I love the occult and yada yada, but also reflecting its time. And what better exemplifies our time than economic social inequality? There's nothing. I mean, I saw a thing the other day that was like, the level of inequality in this country is equal to what it was like under the pharaohs of ancient Egypt.
Jesus Christ.
So yeah, I think it's definitely there. What did you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think given, I also just a couple nights ago rewatched his previous film, the Northman, and all the historical accuracy I was reading about, like all the research he did to ensure all of this accuracy. I don't think he's the kind of director that would put something in or create a dynamic that's done just to like look good on film. I mean, I do know that in this film he attempted to make it slightly more an appetite for like the mainstream audience in a way, like making it a little bit more accessible to people than maybe the Northman or even Vitch was. So I appreciate that, but I think he didn't do it at the sacrifice of the content. And so I don't know if we can specifically talk about how the main character, Thomas Hutter, is just like in the book, is not very wealthy. He's trying to, the setup for the story is he's taking this trip to see Orlok to close this deal to essentially better his life. He has this one chance to improve his station and become a partner in the real estate company. And then on the other end, you have Frederick Harding, who has the shipping business, who he also has a line about how the fact that he doesn't really work or he works hard, but or doesn't work very hard, but the money is good. And someone pointed out to me that maybe he was in like slavery or something adjacent that was like suspicious. And I don't know if that's more of that's a leap, perhaps.
There was somebody that said to me that in addition to the Germany not existing, the other thing that surprised them was the notion of a ship coming from Southeast Europe into Germany, and they were like, "Well, how does a ship passage pass through there?" And well, in the original book, there's a lot of talk about how the ship passes through rivers, through ravine canals into the Baltic, and then through to England there. And so there is some basis for a shipping industry. This one takes place in Germany, 1938, which would not suggest that it's slavery per se, but that, as you said, the character Frederick doesn't really work. You never see him doing anything laborious
No.
or having the same kind of struggle that Thomas has. And I don't think it's a coincidence that I think the first half hour that it's, first of all, the movie comes out on Christmas, and second of all, within the first half hour, you see him go into the real estate company where, as I said in the short episode, everybody looks like Ebenezer Scrooge, right? And they even say to him, "You're 25 minutes late. You've been keeping him for a quarter hour or whatever." And so it gives very much Christmas Carol vibes, where it's like this guy is a pauper trying to take care of his tiny Tim, right? Which we can get into. It's his wife, right? His wife doesn't work. She's very much a commentary on the unemployed working class woman at the time. And so, and it's on him. He's taken the responsibility. I'm going to take the sacrifice of going to Eastern Europe to visit this mysterious count that has all of these like qualifications to meeting him, all these things I have to do in order to like set this up, but it's going to make my life. It's going to make or break it,
Yeah. Yeah. And something you said about anyway, I know I lost there, but yeah. So, but yeah, you make a good point that I know what I was going to mention is this also kind of maybe brings in, I was going to kind of go through, we've already talked about some of the characters, but I wanted to maybe talk about them a little bit more in depth. But I think the one maybe I was really going to start with Orlok, but I think I'd rather start with Ellen Hutter, because the opening scene of the film is of her at a younger time. They don't say exactly how many years or time has passed, but she's essentially calling for someone. And we eventually see her in kind of a scene outside in a graveyard, kind of moaning on her back, potentially having called Orlok or calling a demon, or it's kind of left a little bit ambiguous initially of kind of what's going on. She has some kind of desire to have someone, whether it's a man or just someone to satisfy her desires, and then immediately snaps into the present time a couple of years later, where she's now with Jonathan and kind of has this more quote unquote normal life. And it does seem like an interesting way to bring in Ellen's character and showing kind of maybe her sexual indiscretion or kind of whatever it was, her desires that she had initially, and then kind of making her now be like this sort of typical housewife who, doesn't work, is doing things in the home perhaps, but otherwise is left alone. So I don't know. I think her character, we kind of touched on it at the beginning with maybe why women have identified or enjoyed this film so much, is it seems like the Ellen character is probably the most in-depth and most interesting person within the film outside of, Count Orlok. I don't know what you think.
That opening scene, Ellen is, I don't know if this is supposed to be her parents' house or a friend's house or whatever, but she's in like a mansion.
Yes,
right?
That's true.
She's in a big freaking place, goes out into the courtyard where she summons this demon. And this is like an Eggers motif, which is young girl summoning things that she doesn't really know the power of, right? But she does it anyway because, for whatever reasons, she's outcast by the family or feels isolated and alone. And I think that that's what we have here is Ellen, probably supposed to be depicted as a girl that is just going through puberty now, just having these kind of uh, unfulfilled and unfulfillable sexual desires that are emerging, that not knowing what she's doing, she kind of prays to summon this demon who will come and fulfill those desires. And that's what we get in the opening scene. But then, as you said, the story then is kind of, in that sense, the past catching up with the present, in the sense that she opened this Pandora's box as a young girl, and now I don't know what comes out of Pandora's box. Is it butterflies or whatever? Now they're coming back to reclaim her, even though her life has been already, it has progressed, it has moved on. She's an adult now, and which we could talk more about the sort of commentary on that a little bit later. I think we'll getting into it about the sort of sexual, the sex versus hysteria theme.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it does, and I think when they introduced Jonathan Hutter, her husband, they kind of, and this is one of the instances where I was like couldn't help but kind of comparing him to the other versions, especially the '79 Herzog version, and he seems kind of like this. In another podcast I listened to on Concessions, they did an episode on the Herzog version. And they were kind of arguing about, what to make of the Jonathan Hutter character and kind of seeing him maybe as like this everyman kind of person. And I actually kind of feel like that's kind of what he is here. This, is everyman kind of person. He's, needs to, what's the word? Provide for his family, provide for Ellen. And so he's taking on this kind of risky job to go out to, where Orlok's castle is. And so I think it's a nice way to kind of, they're taking, did I say the wrong name? Did I say Jonathan Hutter?
Yeah, because the original Dracula character is Jonathan.
Okay, that's what I thought. And then as soon as I said that, I'm like, oh, it's Thomas Hutter in this.
Yeah,
not Jonathan.
It's changed, but that's all right. People, I think.
Yeah. So that's okay. But yeah, but I think the kind of the point I was getting to was they're kind of showing, Ellen as being sort of this maybe helpless kind of person who's, now just has to be helped by her husband, and she has this major concern for him to leave. Like it's horrifying thought, and she had also this dream at the beginning, and she's feeling very uneasy, and it's kind of already setting up this concept of this hysterical woman, as you just mentioned. I think we'll talk about a bit later, but I do like that the kind of the setup to where she is going to go as a character, and then kind of end up at the end is quite an arc compared to some of the others.
One thing that I wasn't sure of, and I'm not sure if you picked up on, but it might, depending on the answer, it might contribute to a way that I kind of view this, was Anna Ellen's sister?
I don't think that she's considered her sister. I think it's just her friend.
Her friend. So they're not related to neither Thomas nor Ellen. They're just friends.
No. It seems like they're just friends. And the question, I guess, I don't know if you're asking this, is like, how do they know her? Like, how are they friends? Why is it that Anna, well, unless Anna came up from a background of not very much money and then married into the family of Frederick, and so now has more money. So maybe they were friends prior to, their changing of their kind of their class.
That's what I'm sort of getting at, is if you assume that Ellen and Anna were both born into we'll call it the bourgeoisie of the 19th century, into a sort of upper class family of the 19th century, and you see Anna marry back into that class, right, back into the bourgeoisie through Frederick, whereas Ellen doesn't. And so it's sort of an unfulfilled potential in the sense of Ellen, which would dredge up ideas, images of the past, right? I used to live this life. I used to live this kind of bourgeois life where everything was sort of made for me, and then I found this husband, and now I don't anymore. Which would again, Orlok would kind of enter into that dredging up of the past.
Yeah, and then another thing that they are very not subtly explain is how Thomas Hutter also is seemingly borrowing money from Friedrich's family for, I don't know, their apartment, or just like because he doesn't really have a very good job as of yet. He's kind of doing, maybe grunt work for this real estate firm. And so he's clearly, borrowing money. He doesn't seem to care very much about like being repaid. It's, he's clearly very wealthy. They have a multiple story home and they have staff that are attending to their family. And the other thing that's also maybe worth mentioning is that Friedrich and Anna have two twins, as well as a baby on the way, as we learn early on in the film. And it also seems very much kind of like this. I don't want to call it like a show off, but it's very clear that when you look at Ellen and Thomas, like they don't have children yet. Maybe they don't have the money to be able to support a child, and that's why they're taking this risk to take on this Orlok customer or account or whatever you want to call it to improve his salary and all of that. They definitely are showing this, hey, Anna's like saying to Ellen, like, oh, you can eventually you'll be wealthy again and have kids, and then you can take care of them, or like let someone take care of them for you, and then we can kind of go off and have our sort of have our fancy lives again or whatever.
Yeah,
together.
I think you're onto something again, which is a part of the reason why I would say that I could see why women are liking this more, is because it's also playing with those familial expectations. Like Anna is living the life of a bourgeois, the ideal life of a bourgeois woman of the 19th century. And Ellen is not. And Anna is a person of faith, like as you pointed out. Anna refers to God many times. Ellen does not, right? There's that one scene, I think, where Anna gives Ellen a cross while they're lying in bed. And it's the only time that you really see Ellen engaging with anything godly at all,
Yeah, I think that even has, she even asks her at some point, she says like, this is maybe later and not exactly tied to it, but she says, I think they were by the water when they're like waiting along there. I think she says to Anna, like, do you feel at times that you are not a person? And do you ever feel as though something is coming? And then basically Anna's like, oh yeah, that's God talking to you. Like, of course it's God. It can't be anything other than God. There is nothing. There is no sexual desire. There is no demons or other worldly things. It's God, and it's the only way you can look at things. It's kind of sad.
She's naive in that way. I mean, I think Anna is presented as naive in that way. But whereas, and this is interesting, Anna is naive, but Frederick, her husband, is not naive as much as he's just too chained to science. He's unwilling to believe in any kind of superstition or anything supernatural. He's too bound by science, which is that theme, science versus faith, or science versus superstition, is one that goes back into the original story of Dracula. That's sort of the major point here, which, like, the other characters, Dr. Sievers and von Franz, for example, are the scientific aspect of this,
Yeah, man, that's a good segue to talk about the religion versus science kind of debate. And then I guess on the third end, you have also kind of the occult, which is one area where I actually felt that this film did go off of the other versions and dig deeper into the idea of the occult and kind of devil worship and these other things, especially the way that they had, what do they call his character in this? The Renfield character. It's Herr Knock. Is that his name? Knock, I think.
Yeah, Herr Knock. That's right.
Yeah, he's sort of like, they have there's a moment where he's, naked on a pentagram. I'm terrible with the pentagram, like, basically speaking to Count Orlok from Germany, and kind of telling him what he's going to be doing, how he's helping him and all of that. But we have we've already mentioned von Franz, who's played by Willem Dafoe, in an excellent portrayal by the way, as a aside, which I guess is basically the version of Van Helsing, which they kind of changed his title a bit. And he's sort of the controversial scientist, as I mentioned before. And then we have the other doctor who is more, deep-seated and kind of the standard, which is Wilhelm Sievers, which is the John Seward character in the original novel. So you have this science versus religion and then the occult. But then on the other side of it, going back to bringing in, Ellen again, it's when she starts having these fits and having these sort of, I guess you would call them what's the term when you have epileptic seizures? That's what she's kind of having, or is it not really? Seems something like that. Is they're immediately the Sievers is basically saying like tie her up, make sure she's inside of her corset while she's sleeping to retain her femininity and all these things, and kind of forcing her back to being kind of this subservient woman, and that's what we need her to be. She only misses her husband, whereas the character on the other side, played by Willem Dafoe, Von Franz, says untie her, let her breathe and have her explain to me this whole story, and we can actually get to the bottom of this. And that isn't really bringing in God. That's really kind of the science of the time versus the occult. But I think that the religion does play a role within science, even if they probably don't want to admit to it.
I think that's why Von Franz is such a compelling character, even more than the way that Van Helsing is typically depicted, is because, first of all, I think that Von Franz is an idyllic image of how Eggers wants to see himself, as somebody who's like super learned and in the occult and kind of in his own head and understanding this stuff, who people think are crazy in a way. But it's because he has gone through the ringer of studying the science. Only himself came to alchemy, as they say in the movie. Has the sort of dualistic understanding of science, how it's taught, but also as this occult science. And then that means that while Dr. Sievers is sitting here trying to implement what would be academic science, everything he knows is turned on its head by Von Franz. The occult science is completely different. It is the dark to the light, or whatever you want to see. And so I will say that it's also interesting, and part of the reason why I think Willem Dafoe did such a great job, not just because he's a good actor, but if you recall in Shadow of a Vampire, he played Max Schreck, who was the actor that played Nosferatu in the 1920s. And so he kind of has this Dafoe had played this both sides of this story, I think, which is really interesting.
Yeah, I actually just watched that movie for the first time 2 nights ago. It's not actually easy to find it, so anyone out there, you should definitely check out Shadow of the Vampire if you can find it available. It's a really good story and a super interesting portrayal of kind of, as you said, it's the making of the 1922 Nosferatu, where Willem Dafoe plays Count Orlok as an actual vampire brought in to play the vampire, with unbeknownst to anyone in the cast. And it's just it's such a good meta analysis or meta perspective, and very interesting. And I knew he was in that, but then seeing it after, thinking clearly Dafoe was almost using that former character portrayal in this as kind of the yin yang, almost like the opposite. Now I have to essentially go against the version of myself where I once played the actual vampire. I found it interesting. And just his character was great. One thing we didn't even talk about is the sets and the costumes and the makeup and everything is all just phenomenal. I mean, Dafoe looks really good, has his, and I guess now we kind of skipped over talking about Orlok, which maybe we should talk about him here and kind of how you perceive his character, because another criticism and another thing that people have been saying is he is this more masculine, sort of strong version, whereas in the original Nosferatu, and then especially in the Herzog, he's kind of this frail character who doesn't really have any will to live anymore. It's like a tale in the 79 version of he's kind of tired at the end of his end of this long life, whereas in this it does seem like my perspective was he feels like a very vain character as opposed to this sort of frail version. And, the way he talks to is very like deep and solemn voice, which is just an incredible portrayal. I wouldn't mind having subtitles the next time I watch this too. I think I might have missed a couple of the words he said because it's like going really quickly and he has that deep accent. But I don't know, what do you make of Count Orlok in maybe not just as a character, but maybe how he plays into the class dynamic too, because one of the common tropes of vampires is kind of like the capitalist class or the bourgeoisie, and kind of taking from the workers their we talked about this more in our previous episode, but yeah.
Yeah, I think I really love this version of Orlok because it's different. And so, I watched the interview with Eggers where he said, in going into the creating the film way back when, he said this is a film that he's been making for 10 years. And so he said, way back when, I went into the history books and tried to look up what would a count of Romania look like at this time. And, when you look at the 1920s version, again, the reason why they consider that movie a kind of reflection of emerging anti-Semitism is because all of the stereotypes that come out about Jews in the interwar years, big noses, kind of wearing all black or whatever, all these images that you could see if you look up Nazi propaganda, they are exacerbated in the character of Count Orlok. And so that's why a lot of film scholars say, yeah, this movie is about Eastern Jewry coming to invade Weimar Germany, to upset Germany. And when you're approaching the film now in 2024, or even in the 1970s, I think that you had to kind of account for the susceptibility of that film to just kind of be pigeonholed into you're recreating anti-Semitism, right? Anti-Semitic tropes from the past. You're glorifying it, and so let's dismiss it. Especially with everything that's going on in the country right now. I mean, from a political point of view. And so I think that Eggers had to kind of reimagine this character as somebody who would be more historically accurate in order to cast off this anti-Semitic past that the movie has altogether, which the Herzog version did not do. It did not manage to do that. And so I think that this movie, in the sense that it not only depicts Orlok as what a Romanian 16th century baron would look like, but it also captures the local people within Romania in that scene before he gets to the castle in sort of a historically accurate way, in the sense that, like, obviously nobody in this small ass village speaks English or German, whatever. And so they all kind of laugh at him, which would be expected if this was going on. If this Germanic / English speaking guy rolled up in a small village in Romania, nobody would understand him. And all he could kind of do is show money and have his horse with him and just imply, like, I need to stay here tonight, But then the only word that they would know is Orlok. And so that's what they would hear. And they'd be like, oh, shit, no, don't go there. Like, you can't do that. But he doesn't understand them. And so I think that was also more historically accurate. And I think that's what Eggers was going for with Orlok and with the townspeople. Were trying to get historical accuracy by way of casting off this anti-Semitic history that the movie has.
Yeah, I hadn't considered it that way, but it definitely does not leave any impressions of it being anti-Semitic, as especially the original, like without a doubt. I mean, we talked about this in that previous episode. And I think also with regards to the small town in Romania, they also, what do you, maybe, we don't have to dwell on it too much, but they show them then through Hutter's sort of either imagination or dream, or like he actually does witness this. It's kind of unclear. They kind of leave it a little bit ambiguous, but he goes to sleep after talking to one of these older women, kind of warning him against going into the Orlok's castle. And what he then witnesses is them like removing people from graves and stabbing them the way you would kill a vampire, right? Like a stake through the heart. And then I think later on, Orlok kind of dismisses this as some like, ritual or nonsense that the townspeople do. But was this meant to kind of, do you think that they did this because they were worried that Hutter is maybe bringing upon the whole village death? Like, does Orlok come and kill the whole village? I mean, this is all kind of speculative, but I did find that whole sequence kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think what it's representing is kind of a sort of throwback to previous versions of Dracula or Nosferatu, which are just that, there's a scene in Dracula where Jonathan is in the castle and Dracula comes in with a baby, right? And he kind of throws the baby to his hose and he's like, "Here, this is your supper tonight." And so there's this sense that Dracula is terrorizing these village people. The vampires are terrorizing the village around them. And that's why they know who he is, and that's why even the nun that ends up picking up Jonathan / Thomas, that's why they know what's going on too.
Right.
And so I think that that's what that is kind of referring to without getting too deep into it, which is that whoever they just stuck that stake through was one of Orlok's victims in the past, maybe, or definitely, because when they stab him, they vomit all of the blood, right? And so it's showing, it's showing that, like, yeah, this guy is torturing the townspeople.
Yeah, you do see that torture more in some of the other versions. I think in the 90s version as well, which they kind of show also that the townspeople are forced to kind of help Dracula or Orlok in a way, because if they don't, then he's going to kill, or he does kill them either way. Like, he's going to kill them regardless of all of those things.
Yeah, but they're easily dismissed. And this goes back to the theme of science versus superstition. Thomas or Jonathan, whatever they see, whether Jonathan is given a cross or Thomas is warned to not go to Orlok's castle, or what he sees in this kind of dream reality sequence, all of it can be easily dismissed because in Thomas / Jonathan's mind, this is just crazy peasant superstition, right? This isn't real. I have a job to do it. I'm going to go do it. It's not until he's like in the castle where he realizes, like, oh, this is why they were telling me to not go,
Right. Yeah, that's true. And so there's a couple other areas that we kind of had set aside to talk about. One that we brought up, I guess, earlier in this discussion on the class dynamic and the different kind of roles each of them play. But I brought this up in the teaser episode talking about Silvia Federiци's Caliban and the Witch, which was released in I don't know what year, actually, 2004, I think.
Yeah, I think the early 2000s.
And essentially the book, for anyone who hasn't read it, it's kind of a discussion on the history of Europe's transition into capitalism from a global perspective, and kind of using it to talk about patriarchy within kind of a Marxist feminist lens, and looking at kind of the role of women. And we kind of had some thoughts here on kind of how that ties into this. I don't know if you wanted to talk about, well, either just kind of the book and how it kind of is relevant to this film, or if there's anything else specifically about that was a very high level discussion of what the book is about. I definitely would urge anyone who hasn't read it to check it out.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should preface by saying that I don't think that Eggers has a particularly deep, comprehensive understanding of the socio-economic dynamics of the 19th century. I doubt that he ever read Marx. But what he does know is he has this affinity for the occult and for history. He said in an interview that he'll probably never make a movie that has automobiles in it because that's just not his time period. But what he doesn't understand is that a lot of the material content of the time or the taboo images that we have of the 19th century are themselves a reflection of precisely what Marx was talking about, which is, the socioeconomic position of women in the working class family, or as Marx would say, the disintegration of the working class family in the 19th century. And so I do think that, even while Eggers probably wasn't purposely doing it, we could still say a lot about how this movie is reflecting some of that disintegration of the family, as Marx and Engels talked about.
Yeah, I think what made me initially think about the film too, again, as you can hear by the sound of the title, Caliban and the Witch, and talking about kind of the witch hunts of, in American history, and how it was essentially, blaming women for things that it was easy to blame them for, where they were becoming, some of these women might have just been independent. They were doing things outside of working within the home, or instead of just being kept inside and doing these things, they might have been doing practicing medicine or other needs within the community, and then were easily a source of blame when things went wrong, or there was issues where the male counterparts weren't being successful. And so I think it's an interesting dynamic with the film where you have the Ellen and I almost called him Jonathan and Thomas characters, Thomas Hutter, and then you have the wealthy family, and kind of how the role of the female in both of these families is based on this new reality where there is not it's this continuing formation of the patriarchal society.
Yeah, so what's interesting is that this film takes place in the 1830s, whereas I think the original, I'm not sure if there's a time marker, or maybe it's supposed to take place in the same time as Bram Stoker's original story or something like that. But the time period is really important. This is the sort of height of the Industrial Revolution, or the transition to what some people called Second Industrial Revolution, the turn towards more fossil fuels rather than just coal. And what happens in that period historically is that obviously male workers who previously the household income could have survived, could have sustained itself on the wages of a single male worker, is increasingly becoming inadequate to sustain a household, even of just two people, even of just Thomas and Ellen, which means that adult women workers had to enter into the workforce to earn wages. And, Marx says that this process is propelling all members of the proletarian household into the workforce, simply to keep a family afloat, which means that the disposable time that these people have for things like consumption, or even for sleeping, which obviously Ellen can't do, are all starting to disappear, and it's affecting all members of the family. And so I think that Ellen, as a woman who ostensibly is born into a bourgeois family, but who now has been proletarianized, we could say, into a working class family, faces this reality that you either get to work and help your household, help Thomas, or Thomas is going to have to make some choices that are seriously going to destroy his life and your life. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and like, what do we? So, going back to like briefly to the opening scene where Ellen is, going through kind of an awakening, maybe sexually. You mentioned kind of she's going through puberty. She's calling out for these desires. I mean, I think initially it might have been a sexual desire, even if it wasn't maybe her meeting or realizing it, especially given the kind of the way that women are treated, especially at this period of time in the early 19th century, to the to the time of the story taking place. Is there some sense, God, I'm just trying to think how to ask this question. Do you think in some way she is seeking something beyond just desire for, sensual, or in some way she's seeking a monetary, benefit? I mean, I don't know if she's seeking to, I don't know. As you were talking about just a second ago, I just this came to mind, and maybe it's completely a nothing, that she's also realizes when her husband goes off that he's probably not going to return. Like he's probably going to die on this journey, and Orlok may return in his instead, and in some way they're going to have some kind of confrontation. Can she get something from him beyond simply like this maybe sexual or sensual desire to better her station in life? I keep saying station in life. I don't know. You could tell me I'm completely off base here.
No, I think you're onto something. You reminded me of the awareness or the dread that she felt as Thomas was leaving, right? And she says that she has this feeling that he's not going to return, or that something terrible is going to happen. But what I think from a socio-economic and like historical perspective is the sense that now that this woman has been proletarianized, right? She's been taken from her bourgeois background and rendered into this working class household that is struggling. There's more insecurity there. It means that like if something does happen to Thomas, she's screwed. She doesn't have a source of income anymore, which like is a commentary on this sort of subservience of women at the time, this sort of sense that they become, after they contractually enter into the marriage bond, they become a form of private property for the male, in the sense that whatever happens to him has major effects on the rest of her life. Right? She would, hypothetically, if Thomas did die, she would have had to live with Anna if that was a possibility, or
Right.
or go to work, begin earning wages herself. And I think that's sort of the historical reality of that insecurity of him leaving, which is not just 19th century characters going off to an Eastern European count's castle, but of, I think, 19th century women experiencing the feeling that they had when their husbands left for long periods of time. And
Yeah.
this is something I actually wrote about. Is the 19th century is the time of exploration, of circumnavigations, of different European empires are sailing around the world. And I did some research on, for example, Russia's first circumnavigator, who sailed in 1812. And in the archive, I found letters from his grandchildren, right, handwritten in like little kid Russian, that were about how they missed him and about how they were looking forward to seeing him again, and yada yada. And meanwhile, this dude is in Hawaii or something. He's like he's on the other side of the world. And it made me think that it's not just women, obviously, but it's the entire domestic sphere that a lot of these men are leaving for months on end. And if something
Yeah.
happens to them, there's no guarantee that their wife will get some kind of pension to take care of the family. So it's a very insecure century, I think.
Yeah, and then you could probably carry this over to later with just men going off to war and other things where, again, there's no guarantee that they're going to have any kind of, benefits after the war if their husband dies. And so there's just this definite fear. It's, again, like another thing you mentioned early on, where like these horror movies kind of play on the fears of the time. I think one of the biggest fears for a woman would be that she is kind of left without any way to survive. Right, like Ellen could easily be left with nothing.
Yeah, it's the sense that something happened to me, and the world is not taking it serious. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or I'm having these experiences that, and this is another, the history of medicine in the 19th century comments on. There's all the history of hysteria and yada yada. Regardless of Foucault, you can think of Foucault when you think of the history of hysteria and yada yada. But even beyond there, it's very developed that a lot of it was just. I had an advisor who wrote a book called Console and Classify. A lot of it was women would come into psychiatric treatment facilities where they would just do exactly that. They would console them. Oh no, everything will be okay. Everything will be all right. And then just pigeonhole them into some classification, which was usually related to hysteria in some way. And so, they needed to be institutionalized, because whatever they were experiencing, whether schizophrenia or demonic visitations from a vampire, could not be believed, right? It was just their way of escaping the domestic duties or the duties to earn a wage.
Well, I mean, that's actually a perfect segue, which I think maybe is one of the last topics that maybe kind of takes us also kind of to the end of the film. And I want to also briefly mention an article I found, and maybe this will kind of end it here too, or unless there's another area. But you were talking about kind of the, how women are believed and what they're seen. We already kind of talked about the science versus, the kind of the occult, and how the different characters react to Ellen's sort of issues, or I say, issues is not the right word, but what's going on with her psyche and her mental health and her physical health. And I think you noted that it's kind of a story about trauma, and we don't really know exactly what happened, that she kind of shares with her husband later on when he returns. Like, she kind of refers to some sort of indiscretion. It's not exactly detailed. It could be that she had been, sexually assaulted, or she had been abused, or she had something had happened to her at a younger age that he seems to be upset by, but still does remain by her side. He is a pretty loyal husband, when it comes down to it, trying to do everything to help her. But I don't know how that kind of plays into the vampire, piece. But I think in some ways that I don't know, the vampire is kind of this, my perception maybe is that vampire in this could be the metaphor for like the violence that men, perpetrate against women, and, that she has been abused or whatever happened by a demon is kind of how it's kind of shown to us, but we don't really know what that is. And the men in her life generally don't believe what's happening to her, and dismiss her and tie her up literally and throw her back and just say like, yeah, you dismiss your husband, you'll be fine.
You know what? First of all, I think you're absolutely right that Orlok is a depiction of this kind of stereotypical male aura energy archetype. But it also, like, his mustache reminds me of those 19th century strongmen, in like the leotards who do the lifting. That's what he looks like. He is, in that sense, a kind of stereotypical man with a deep voice. And I watched another interview with Eggers where he said that Skarsgård had to take like operatic lessons in order to produce the deepness in the voice. It's real. Like, it wasn't something that they like did post production, but it was actually his voice that was doing that. So it's intentional that he's supposed to be this manly representation of masculinity of a certain form.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that definitely is possible. And then what was the other last thing that I was going to tie to? I was thinking related to this. Well, one of the other things too, like, it's also a weird thing where Orlok might represent that archetype of a man, but at the same time, she's also like seeking to be, I don't know, accepted and comforted by Orlok, because her husband, who she loves dearly, like goes off and kind of, in a way, is also a bit dismissive of her, like dismissive of her concerns of his well-being. Like, maybe we won't be well off financially, but you would be safe and we would be safe. Like, you could just find a different job. But it seems like, she's being tormented by Orlok, but also feels like she wants to be fulfilled by him, both maybe, sexually perhaps. And I don't know, it's this weird desire that she has that's dismissed by all men, generally in this time. And, even to now, and maybe even go into playing with why some men maybe dislike this movie or dislike the character or don't like Orlok's portrayal because of those different things.
It kind of strikes me as the like revenge of the ex. You know what I mean? Like, there's a sense that, thinking about it from a purely like relational standpoint, there's a sense that Orlok was that man in my past that fulfilled all of the sexual desires that I had at that age, right? The sort of the rawness, and I'm getting really weird here, the rawness of adolescent sex, like where you first start it, because it's so new. You're open to experimenting anything, and you can experiment with a demon for all, for whatever reason. Um, that, a lot of that leaves in adulthood for some people, and that this is the sense of what's the word I'm looking for? Inadequacy, I guess, that Thomas is experiencing. That, like, I can give Ellen a life with a real living, breathing person that's not a bloodsucker or a demon, um, and I'm still struggling to earn an income for her and our family, yada yada. But at least it's not. At least it's real. At least it's tangible. It's not something
Right.
past, and it doesn't require her to bring back the ex-boyfriend, right? Even though the ex-boyfriend is there and he's saying, like, I'm still here to get freaky if you want to, but she's moved on. She doesn't want to get freaky anymore. That's the sort of sense that I get from that. And then, the ending, the big spoiler, I guess, here, is this sort of acknowledgement that in order to let this demon rest, I have to indulge it. Like, I have to do it.
Yeah, and not only does she have to do it, but she's also doing it in part for her husband. Like, she acts completely unselfishly, which I think it's kind of a different perspective of how she acts, where it is similar to the 79 version and maybe the original of kind of, convincing the demon or Nosferatu or Orlok to come in, kind of trick him to staying longer than he should be, and then he eventually dies because of the sunlight, or in this case, before like the last crow or the first crow of the in the morning. And she does this as a completely selfless act where she doesn't have to do it, but she sees the people around her suffering and is willing to make this sacrifice. And then it also gives us, slightly related, is maybe one of the most horrifying and haunting shots of any horror movie I've seen this year, when the kind of shriveled up Orlok is lying on top of her. Like, that shot is just, I tried to look for it online, but no one got a picture, or I couldn't find it, but that just kind of stuck out to me in my mind. It's just an incredible shot. And it just, I don't know. I thought the ending was very satisfying. I thought I just at the end, I'm like, damn, that shit ruled.
Yeah, I mean, one might be able to say that the final act of her, I guess, killing Orlok by allowing them to consummate, I guess, one might say that is her going to work in bed, right, for the benefit of the household, for Thomas. Again, commenting on this idea that in order for working class families to exist at the time, women had to enter the workforce increasingly, and this was her way of doing it, I guess, if you want to continue on that sort of Marxist reading. But I agree with you. That last shot was monumental in a way, and it was very, I have to say, 19th century. It had like it was one of the shots that had the most 19th century Gothic feel to me. You know what I mean? And I don't know how.
Yeah.
It was like the colors. It was like I don't know what it was, but it just felt old.
Yeah, there were a lot of scenes and shots. I think we mentioned briefly in the other episode, when he's arriving at the castle. There's lots of these long, drawn out shots, but that shot really, I mean, again, it's at the end of the film, so maybe that's why it sticks with you, but it really stuck with me. Just that shot is just pretty iconic. And then I'm going to read one, so I found an article, which I'll link in the show notes. It's from a website called filmfreakcentral.net, and it's a review, more of analysis, I guess you could say, about Nosferatu, and it has some quotes and brings in some other films, but it also, at the very last line, I think it's worth also talking about it, also in a way that Ellen is dressed in basically what appears to be like a wedding gown. She's dressed in white. And the last line from this article is, in a wedding gown, Ellen, alone, except for the demon caged inside of her, marries the parts of her that a patriarchal society would push apart. If there's a future, it's female. It was always this way. and I think it's a good way to kind of tie in. I don't think they mention Caliban and the Witch in this article, but I think it's a good way to tie it in. This patriarchal society that was kind of thrust upon her, and she couldn't maybe make it in that type of society. She wasn't willing to give up that, and so instead she makes the ultimate sacrifice to I guess in a way save that society, save that patriarchal society.
Yeah,
Maybe.
that's a
I
good
don't
way
know.
to put it, I think.
Yeah. But that's kind of all I had in terms of things. I mean, we didn't talk as much about maybe some of the plot or some of the various scenes. But I don't know, were there any other scenes or moments that you like that stick out to you as memorable? And then we can sign off, I suppose.
I need to rewatch it because there were a number of scenes that just from a cinematic technique point of view, I appreciated, and I think, and again, I watched Edgar's talk about this because as it is a film that he had been working on, as he says, for the past 10 years, he was also seemed to be really cognizant of the fact that he couldn't make this film prematurely, that he had to
Right.
kind of get his feet wet with production first and other movies in order to take on what was such an influential movie for him. And you can definitely see that. The scenes on the Demeter on the ship were really great, which was my favorite in the original Dracula story. Um,
Yeah.
uh,
I love
the
the graveyard scenes for me, like when they go into the crypt. No, what is it called? Like
the crypt, yeah, where
the
the
crypt. Yeah, they go into a crypt and they're ripping things open, and I yeah, like those were really just the lighting and the mood that you feel. I know some people were complaining that they felt that the score was not ominous or dark or scary or anything like that. I disagree. I thought it like had the right notes at the right time. It was like kind of like low, but then it kind of it picked up what it needed to. And I don't know, like I still have some, it's not a perfect movie, as movies rarely are, but it's I definitely want to see it again, and I would urge anyone listening to go see this if you haven't yet.
the scene in the castle, which is supposed to be the big first reveal of Orlok, it doesn't really reveal him as much as you're anticipating the entire time a kind of shot of his face, right? That does reveal this scary character, but you don't really get that. You get like side angles, you get some distant shots where you can kind of make out a face, and what you're making out is scary, but it's not close enough to like the original Nosferatu or the 70s one where like you know exactly what he looks like. And it never gets that close to where there's like a full frontal 1920s Nosferatu shot of his face. But I think that works because again, that's working with the shadows to sort of create this sense of dread because you are in your seat dreading the moment where you do actually see his face, but you don't get it.
It reminds me, which I've mentioned on this podcast and other episodes. It's like the Hitchcock like bomb under the table, like where you're like the audience is watching, waiting it for it to like blow up, but it doesn't. Like he just makes you keep anticipating. And then what's funny, you mentioned full frontal because there is a full frontal
Yeah.
shot of Orlok, which I do appreciate that they kind of leave it for a while to imagination where you're like you see a little bit but you get like little tastes as it goes through, and then later on you get the full shots that you want to see, and then the very last shot of him just as this emaciated corpse. But yeah, I don't know, that's I'm sure that I was thinking we could probably do this episode a whole different hour and have a whole different a bunch of things that we could probably talk about, but I think we hit everything I had. What about you? Anything left, Alex?
Yeah, I think we could talk about the wiener shot for another hour, but we don't have to get into that. Which is one of those things that at first I was like, that's goofy. But then I remembered what happened to the Sonic movie, right? Where like they had the trailer for the Sonic movie and all these nerds came out and were like, that's not what Sonic would actually look like and blah blah blah. that like I think that if they didn't show the wiener in that scene, you would have had people be like, well, Dracula's supposed to be a man and he would have a wiener there and you didn't put anything there, and that's not real. So like
Yeah.
you had to kind of do it. You had to be like, all right, if he's gonna be naked, he's gonna be naked. You know?
Yeah. Fuck it. Just do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, yeah, that's for sure. But Alex, again, thank you for coming on and talking some gothic vampiric. Is that a word? Vampiric horror with me.
Yeah, next vampire movie. I don't know when it's gonna be, but that's the next time I'll be back on the show.
Yeah. You know, I have. Well, we can discuss offline, but I have some thoughts. I wouldn't mind somehow bringing in the shadow of a vampire with something else. I'm not sure exactly what, but something else. I mean, there is, of course, the '79 version of that, but at some point, someone's going to make something again. This won't be the last. You said in our other episodes, there's 170 some odd, Dracula vampire stories, and God knows what else, related to it. But Alex, appreciate you coming on and talking vampires, and we'll look forward to another one in the future.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, and you've been listening to Left of the Projector, and we'll catch you next time.